on Smith Island, and he got a bad case of sunburn. You might know no solar came in. His condition was met with buttermilk. They rubbed it down with buttermilk each night. And after 3 or 4 days of fishing, Henry had a meeting in Hampton, and he left the boat and went out, and they caught the Northampton, which was leaving Cherrystone and going to Hampton, and they boarded it, and just him and his son, and they went into Hampton. And when they got there, it was a huge crowd, a larger than normal crowd at the dock, and it was because ex-President John Tyler was there, who was a close friend of Henry Wise. And so Henry took the opportunity to take his young son John, who was about 6 years old, and introduced and spent some time with him. Thus began his last book, because John Wise would go on to have a great career on the Eastern Shore. From the Eastern Shore, he would be a soldier in the Civil War. He would be a congressman. He'd be a candidate for governor. He would lose and go to New York and become the lawyer for the Edison Company. He would return to the Eastern Shore, live at Kiptopeke, which is right, the house is right where the toll is located for the bridge tunnel. And during that time, he wrote many books, and in my opinion, he's the best writer who ever hailed from the Eastern Shore. His last book is Reminiscences of 13 Presidents. And it begins with the story I just told you. It ends with Theodore Roosevelt, who was a good friend part of the time of his life and an enemy, but a man that he immensely respected and had a great deal to do with. And it made me think that when you judge people or you think about people, it is not just the life they led, the offices they held, and what they personally did, but their life would revolve around the events that they were a part of and the people that they were associated with. And that's what John Wise lets you know in his book. And so it is with this lady. She is born into the most prominent family on the Eastern Shore. Her father would own over 45,000 acres of land. He would be a surveyor, he would be the sheriff, he'd be a member of the House of Burgesses, he would be Speaker of the House of Burgesses. He fancied himself as a doctor. He was a lawyer, probably the best lawyer on the Eastern Shore. And he was the power broker, and the reason that the Eastern Shore would eventually be divided into 2 counties. He was always also the head of the militia, and was notorious for what we call in the Eastern Shore the ditch murder. And he was very fond of his oldest daughter, much more so, I think, than his son Charles. He and Charles didn't quite get along on all occasions. And another person she impressed was a friend of his who was governor of Virginia, Governor Barclay. And in fact, on one occasion, Nathaniel Littleton was visiting with Governor Barclay, and he wrote him and asked him to give this lady and her sister a couple of ewe lambs from him, the governor, personally. And in his correspondence with him, and he would ask how his girl Tabitha was doing. Now, she is married, as you read from the bio, when she is 14. Her sister didn't wait that long. Her sister was married when she was 13. Eastern Shore girls there were much more opportunities for girls to get married than there were guys, and 14 is not an extraordinarily young age. There are Eastern Shore girls that are married at age 12. Her first husband was John Smart, and they lived right off of Mogothie Bay. And he was a successful plantation owner and lived right next to where she grew up. Her father would leave Northampton County in 1649 and come to, it was still part of Northampton at that time, come to the south side of Occohannock Creek, and that's where he set up his empire. From the south side from the north side of Occohannock Creek, he had 6 ships that would travel he traded up New Amsterdam, he traded in Boston, he traded in Europe, he traded in the Caribbean. I always thought it was fascinating. He imported moose hides from Canada and had 6 shoemakers making shoes on Occohannock Creek in the 1650s and 60s. And I would ask the question, how many shoemakers do we have making shoes on the Eastern Shore today? His biggest enterprise was making salt, which is the oldest enterprise on the Eastern Shore. And so his daughter grew up around all of the important people that her father knew. And when she's married to another important person. And when he died, she marries Deborah O'Brien. Now, Deborah O'Brien is classified as a merchant. He owned well in excess of 10,000 acres. But he had land in Accomack County, he had land in Northampton County. We don't know exactly where she lived, but I have a really good idea that she lived not far from where she was living when she was married to John Smart, because Brown had land in that area. And not only that, one of the executors of his estate, she would be the executress of the estate, but one of the administrators of the estate was John Custis, who lived on a neighboring plantation on Plantation Creek right off of Magothi Bay. So I think her first three husbands, she all lived in the same area. Deborah O'Brien, we know that he went to England on numerous occasions, and we think that it was on one of these occasions that this portrait was done by Peter Lely. I know that in November of 1671, he brought back and received 50 acres for each of the 41 people that he brought back to the colony. And that was in November of 71. In March of 72, he brought in 96 people. It could have been on either of these two trips that she accompanied, went to England and had her portrait done by Peter Lely, who was the best known portrait painter in England at that time. And they think that his studio literally did thousands of portraits, and that whether his hand ever touched this, we're not sure, but this portrait is attributed to him. When she was married to Deborah O'Brien, she had a servant that she was not happy with. And I want to tell you a little bit about what sort of her character was. And she approached the court and she said she had a pretend servant of which she was not getting the services that she thought that she deserved and needed. And sure enough, in the next court session, this pretend servant not only was not providing her the service, but he had left the premises, and she was letting anyone know that if they gave him any shelter or they transported him, she would have the fullest extent of the law. In the next court case, in the next session of the court, she admonished the sheriff, who obviously had come across this pretend servant and not done his job, and she held him accountable, and the court did too, and the sheriff was forced to pay bond for the behavior of this servant to make sure that this servant would do what she wanted. Another fascinating thing that occurred when she's married to Deborah O'Brien is that her father sent a young Indian girl to Governor Barclay. And in return, Barclay sent a 9-year-old Indian girl to the Eastern Shore. A cavalier attitude with human life, to say the least. And Edmund Scarburgh gave that 9-year-old Indian girl to his daughter. And so imagine in a house that she has all these servants, and you bring this Indian girl into the house, and what conversations would take place. And that's what I always sort of think of. When Deborah O'Brien died, very shortly after that, she was the administrator of his estate. In some cases after that, she was listed as a lawyer, which is an incredible thing in the 17th century. And she was shortly thereafter that married John Custis, which is just a plantation owner. She would go from Deborah O'Brien to John Custis, and we don't know what Brian's house was like, but we know for sure what John Custis' house was like. It was not only the finest home, the largest home on the Eastern Shore, it was the finest home in the 17th century Chesapeake world. There's only one that would come close, and that would be Governor Barclay's home at Green Springs. But most people don't think that it would meet the measure of what Arlington looked like. And I would tell my students that the typical house of the Eastern Shore in the 17th century is about a 16 by 20 with a dirt floor and a loft. And Arlington, at the same time, when people are living in a dirt floor, no windows in most of these houses, he has a three full stories, full English basement, 3 full stories, and an attic and the house was 56 by 43 feet. A huge structure at the time, a magnificent house, and she would be the lady of the house. And of course, the most significant event that occurred is in 1676, we had Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia. I always maintained that it's one of those things that doesn't quite get the credit you deserve, and I would say that it's the most significant event to occur in Virginia history prior to the Revolutionary War. And the rebellion which Bacon leads on the western shore carries to the eastern shore, because when Governor Berkeley is run out of Jamestown, he will come and he will stay at Arlington. So literally the capital of Virginia is out of this lady's house, and she is the mistress of the house. Militarily, what occurs is that her husband, John Custis, and for our clarification, we call him John II. Her husband is made general of all the king's forces in Virginia, and he gathers a group of men, and they will go with the governor back to Jamestown, where they will be defeated, and then the governor will return to her house and will stay there. Bacon, in the meantime, sends an appeal to the people of Accomack and trying to encourage them to give up the governor, of which John Custis has absolutely no interest in. But he also captures a couple of ships, and he sends them in hope of capturing the governor and taking care, in his case, ending the rebellion successfully. Well, what happens is the ship anchored right off of her house on Old Plantation Creek. One of the captains let him know that his crew is still loyal to the governor, and that if they could overtake the guards, that his men would join them, just like in an old pirate movie. That's exactly what occurs. And people sneak out from Arlington, they will take over one of the ships, they will take over the other ships, and pretty soon all the guys that came to try to capture Berkeley are captured in turn, and Berkeley will begin to hang. The first people that are hung in Bacon's Rebellion will be hung at Arlington, either on the ground or on the ships, and eventually he will return to Jamestown. The king will personally thank John Custis for his part in restoring this. Berkeley will go back to England, and so she is a key player in this most significant event that occurs, and through John Custis she will know all the key players in Virginia at that time. When John Custis dies, she will shortly thereafter marry Edward Hill. Now, John Custis was rich. Edward Hill is really rich. It is the Hill family which will build Shirley Plantation, and in fact, his plantation at that time is called Shirley. The very place today that you go on the James River, you see that magnificent Hill Carter house, Shirley. Robert E. Lee's mother was born there, as many other important Virginians. That's not the house, but that's the location in which she lives. And she actually had a prenuptial agreement to her benefit, that she would sort of keep everything that she had, and she could sort of get some of Mr. Hill's stuff. And when he died, it worked out far, and she would return to the Eastern Shore, not to be married again. And she would eventually then come to live in Accomack County. She had a daughter by her first husband, Smart, and by this time she has a granddaughter that's of marrying age. She had a son by Brown who lived old enough to get married but died childless, so there are no descendants from that. But her granddaughter would marry her husband, John Custis's nephew, and a boy Edmund that he raised like a son, would marry. So her granddaughter marries her and her husband's nephew, and they lived at Deep Creek Plantation. Now, Deep Creek is not the location of the village. For us to get there, it'd be going down the Mink Farm Road, and Edmund was very fond that she would live in that house and live long enough to see her great-grandchildren grow up and live to be 80 years old, and was very active in affairs of the court, owned many thousands of acres of land, and took care of her own business, I think probably more so than any woman on the Eastern Shore in the 17th century. And I always thought that she looks like the type of woman that would sort of take care of the business. last time that she was mentioned in court was in the inventory of Edmund Custis, family at Hills Farm. And we know that this portrait hung at Hills Farm. The Bailey family had no genealogical connection to the Custis family where the portrait was, but Hills Farm, Dick Creek, not that far apart. How I got there, we'll never know unless you find something in the attic to let us know. Ms. Brown will guarantee it. We'll let us know when you come back and we'll tell you that again. But the Baileys moved from Hill Farm to Mount Custis, and this portrait went with it. It would descend into Mrs. Bailey Tiffany, the daughter of Thomas Bailey, who was a congressman from the Eastern Shore and lived in Mount Custis. She was a wealthy lady. She not only, she gave to many charitable causes, she endowed scholarships so that some of your children and grandchildren have gone to the University of Virginia on Bailey Tiffany money. It's to this day, it's one of the largest endowments they have of scholarships of its type. But she also, when she died, she left money during the height of the Depression to build the art museum at the University of Virginia, and she left this portrait and other portraits in silver and dishes and to the University of Virginia. 30 years ago, I went in search of it. And I went to the museum and I spent the entire day there and worked my way through the staff. It was the 5th person I talked to that day, and each person I asked them a question. I wanted to see her, and they had no idea where she was. And I would casually say, by the way, how did the name Bailey ever come to apply to this building? And the first 4 people had no clue. And it was only the 5th person who said, I think it was someone who donated money back like 1920s or so. So I said, bingo, that's right. And he knew where she was. And then after he told me where she was, well, we have her in storage, and it's like, you can leave now. I said, well, I've been here for about 4 hours. I really want to see her. And so I went down to the basement, and she was in a storage case in the basement, and they just pulled her out. And it was kind of dingy, and that's what I saw, and I thought, wow, we need to have her at Car Place. And 30 years ago, I tried. Other people have tried in intervening years since. And what happened is last year, I had a group of 40 ladies from Charlottesville who came and went to 18th Century Homes in Northampton County on one day, and then they came and we went to see Ms. Knox, Eastern Shore Antiques, and I brought them here for lunch. And I was telling them the story of this lady and pointed out how disappointed, and since they were from Charlottesville, I was letting them know personally how disappointed. At that time, the University of Virginia had not only, they wouldn't let her have us, but they had just changed the name from the Bailey Museum to the Fralin because someone else had given them a lot of money. And I was letting these ladies know, I told them about how they wouldn't let us have her and how disappointed I was. They changed the name. This poor lady in the height of depression gives a chime and silver. That's gone. That's just sort of went in the wind. And they got these portraits they don't display and won't let us borrow. Well, and then we went to see 2 great homes. We went to see Hills Farm, and they totally enthralled. Mr. Brown met these ladies at the gate. There were a couple of them went to take him home with them. He had him on a go-kart. It was this old lady who had difficulty walking, and she said, "My, he's a cutie." Then we went to Bones Folly, and they were just thrilled with Bones Folly that had the time to let us go through these great homes. And so they said this really great feeling about the day. And that night, we're eating at Bizzotto's, and these 2 ladies come and sit down right next to me, and they said, by the way, we're on the board of the Fralin. And I said, I heartily apologize. They said, oh no, I agree with you. Well, and she said, we have a meeting that I think was Tuesday, and I'm going to bring that up. Well, that Tuesday, I got a call from the director of the Fralin, and that we put in the works, and then he had to go director, and so I gave him Hillary's information. He called Hillary, and so long story short, this is the long trip Tabitha has to finally come home And at the time that I saw her and pulled her out of the storage, she hadn't been seen in 20 years. They have a card there to let you know the last time she was displayed. And I think it was like 1955, and it was on loan to Richmond. So this lady's been she's been in the closet, and we're so glad to have her out of the closet. Now there is a story in the Bailey family that actually the person that she was originally left to, the individual's wife, thought there was a little bit too much showing of Tabitha and refused not only to display her, but refused to have her in the house, and so it went to another person in the family. I like it. Yeah. But at any rate, I just think we're delighted to have her back home. And I decided that they have some other really great artwork that is also in the basement. They have this great portrait of George Washington that hung at Mount Custis, probably at Hills Farm too. They have a Henry Custis portrait by Hyselius. We're not sure which Henry it is, but it's a great portrait. And then they have Thomas Bailey, who is and his wife, a very significant congressman. So we're going to hit them up. They're give a little bit of time. We're going to hit them up. But I also think it's great for Tabitha to be in this room, because you're looking at two other great works of art. And if you didn't notice, these are two of the earliest Charles Wilson Peels that are known to exist. And some years ago, we had a group from the Maryland Historical Society that I gave a tour of the house to, and they have a large collection of Peels, and a lot of them were really sort of Peel scholars, and they had knew nothing about these portraits, and they really didn't care about anything else in the house but these. Yeah. We care about everything in the house. We're particularly glad that Tabitha's home. We hope that she has a long reign in this house. And the other thing I'll let you know is usually I dress a lot more shabbily than I do. I thought it would be great if she was the type of person that had a pretend servant, that she would be disappointed if I spoke with pretend clothes. We're glad that you have. We hope that you enjoyed Tabitha, and thanks for coming.